I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen bee.
The decision was delivered without ceremony, without warning, and with none of the careful language Buckingham Palace normally uses when the stakes are this dangerous. Prince William had seen enough. Newly uncovered files had crossed his desk, and within hours, Camilla's remaining royal privileges were being stripped away. Access, influence, ceremonial authority, gone. But the most devastating part was not what William removed. It was what those files had apparently convinced him could no longer be ignored. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William had been examining a sealed collection uncovered during an internal review when one marked entry stopped him cold. The records covered late-reign correspondence, private access approvals, household decisions, and sensitive royal communications that had never been expected to resurface together. A royal household authorization, meaning formal permission controlling who may enter restricted spaces or influence certain internal arrangements, appeared repeatedly across the files. For the prince, that detail transformed an uncomfortable review into something far more serious. William reread the final passage slowly. He closed the folder, placed his pen beside it, and looked toward the senior aide waiting nearby. Issue the order. Nothing more was needed. The instruction removed Camilla's remaining discretionary privileges, selected private access permissions, influence over certain household appointments, use of restricted royal facilities, and participation in closed family consultations. Discretionary privileges were benefits granted through internal royal authority, rather than rights automatically guaranteed by her position, which meant they could be withdrawn without removing her title as queen. Camilla received the decision privately, and disbelief came first. She demanded to know whether Charles had approved what his son had done. The aide offered no immediate answer. That hesitation cut deeper than any formal wording could have managed. She asked again, slower this time, because the queen consort understood exactly what silence could mean inside a family, where loyalty was often expressed through what people refused to say. Charles felt the trap closing almost immediately. He wanted to protect his wife, yet the king had already been shown part of the material William believed threatened the credibility of the crown. One previously unseen record connected private decisions made behind closed doors to an authorization that should never have progressed unnoticed. The future king no longer believed limiting Camilla's influence was enough. He believed the boundary itself had already been crossed. Camilla learned the final detail before she could confront William. Charles had seen the evidence. More devastatingly, he had not immediately defended her. Her anger shifted toward something colder, as she realized the confrontation ahead involved far more than lost access or wounded pride. And as Camilla turned toward the one man she expected to stand beside her, the silence coming from Charles revealed that this battle was no longer simply between a queen and an heir. Behind the titles were three people now forced into a confrontation years in the making. William carried the burden of protecting a monarchy he would one day inherit. Camilla faced the terrifying possibility that decades spent securing her place beside Charles could disappear with a single order. And the king himself stood between them, knowing that whatever choice he made would wound someone he loved, and perhaps expose something the palace had buried for too long. William understood exactly why the decision felt personal, even though he had tried to treat it as duty. As heir, meaning the person next in line to inherit the throne, the prince believed he carried a responsibility to protect the institution before it became his own. Trust mattered, because every private arrangement could eventually become a public weakness. He had watched the monarchy survive scandals before, and he refused to inherit problems that everyone else had been too afraid to confront. Camilla felt something very different. She had spent years moving from controversy toward acceptance, enduring public anger before eventually becoming royal consort, the spouse of the reigning monarch who shares ceremonial responsibilities without holding the sovereign's independent authority. Now the queen consort saw privileges she had slowly gained disappear almost overnight. To her, the order did not feel administrative. It felt like years of belonging were being questioned in a single stroke. William walked alone before meeting his father, repeating the same warning inside his head. "Do not let anger lead." He knew confronting Camilla meant confronting Charles as well, because every accusation against her would eventually reach the king. The future king wanted his father to understand that this was not revenge, yet he also feared that Charles would hear betrayal before he heard duty. Camilla asked the question directly when she finally sat with Charles. "Do you believe what is in those files?" He did not answer immediately. The king looked away for only a moment, but she caught it. That hesitation hurt more than the restrictions themselves, because she understood that her husband was no longer deciding whether to defend her. He was deciding how much of what he had read could still be defended. Charles wanted to preserve his marriage, while William wanted to preserve the crown from private interference. Father and son now understood loyalty in painfully different ways. Worse, the prince had not reacted to one dramatic page. Several separate records appeared to show the same pattern: access expanded, influence quietly exercised, boundaries repeatedly tested. Then one entry changed the emotional weight of everything. It pointed back to a private royal gathering months earlier, where a small disagreement had ended with William leaving the room in controlled fury. Because the files had not created William's suspicions from nothing, they had confirmed something that began on one unforgettable night, when a private argument crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Long before the order was issued, there had been a warning. Not a public scandal, not a screaming confrontation. Just one private evening when William heard something he was never supposed to hear, and watched Camilla make a request he would never forget. At the time, the moment was contained. Doors closed. Voices lowered. Everyone moved on. But when the newly discovered files revealed what happened afterward, that forgotten exchange became the point of no return. Camilla had been pushing against a boundary that nobody had clearly defined. Her informal influence had grown around household appointments, restricted spaces, private family consultations, and preparations connected to William's future reign. A royal household, meaning the network of staff, offices, and private systems that support members of the monarchy, depends on clear lines of access. Charles knew that. Yet the king repeatedly tried to stop small disagreements from becoming family warfare, and every compromise left another line blurred. William entered the Windsor discussion unexpectedly and immediately understood the danger. Camilla was asking Charles to approve expanded access for 2 members of her personal household to a restricted stream of royal correspondence, meaning private communications limited to selected senior figures and trusted staff. The prince objected at once. She answered that the matter belonged to the reigning king's household, and her tone made the division unmistakable. Charles said nothing when his son turned toward him. William waited, expecting the monarch to draw the line himself. The silence stretched. Then the future king pushed his chair back and said quietly, "I will remember this conversation." Camilla heard the warning. The king heard it too. Nobody in that room could later claim they misunderstood what had happened. Charles found his son afterward and tried to contain the damage. He asked William not to turn one dispute into a constitutional family crisis, a conflict where private behavior begins threatening the monarchy's public order and authority. The prince reluctantly agreed. He told his father that he would not escalate the matter, but only if the boundary was respected from that moment forward. Then the new files changed everything. William discovered that an alternative internal authorization had apparently been pursued after the Windsor confrontation, allowing the disputed access to move forward through another channel. One handwritten notation connected that authorization directly to the same chain of records now sitting on his desk. Camilla understood the implication almost immediately. William had not simply rediscovered an old argument. He had found what he believed was proof that the warning had been bypassed. She stopped speaking through aides and demanded to see him herself. The paperwork had exposed the past, but when Camilla walked into the room to confront William herself, the conflict finally acquired a voice. There were no cameras, no public statements, and no crowd of courtiers to soften what came next. William and Camilla stood face to face with the files between them, and years of buried tension surrounding every word. She wanted her privileges restored. He wanted an explanation. Neither was willing to retreat. Then Camilla challenged his authority to punish the wife of a reigning king. And William answered with the one accusation she had been desperate to avoid. Camilla entered convinced that William had crossed a line of his own. She believed consequences affecting the king's consort should have been discussed inside the family before any internal order was enforced. A royal consort, meaning the spouse of the sovereign who supports the monarch without holding the crown independently, still occupies a powerful position inside palace life. To the queen, stripping away access without a settlement felt less like discipline and more like public humiliation waiting to happen. William refused to soften his position. "You had no right to do this," Camilla told him. The prince slid one file across the table and answered that the authorization inside it was exactly why he had acted. An internal authorization, meaning formal permission granted within the royal household to allow access or involvement in restricted matters, carried weight because it could quietly shift influence without any public announcement. Camilla insisted that everything she had done was intended to protect Charles and keep his household stable. She argued that difficult decisions often required discretion, especially when the king was under pressure. William did not raise his voice. He told her that good intentions could not excuse bypassing a boundary after it had been clearly stated. Diana's shadow made the exchange even heavier. William did not present his mother as evidence, nor did he turn the argument into a speech about the past. But the future king had grown up understanding what secrecy, divided loyalties, and hidden palace decisions could do to a family. Camilla knew that history lived inside his reaction, and she understood why trust meant something different to him. William then delivered the part she had hoped to reverse. The restrictions would remain. Additional household authorities linked to the disputed access would also be reviewed. Camilla reached toward the file, stopped before touching it, and slowly withdrew her hand. Silence took over. The queen stared at William. He did not move. For several seconds, neither spoke, and the stillness carried more force than another accusation could have done. Then the balance shifted. Charles summoned his son privately. William had confronted Camilla as a son carrying old wounds, but Charles was about to confront him as a king whose authority could not simply be ignored. The most dangerous conversation was never going to be between William and Camilla. It was always going to be between father and son. Charles had tolerated disagreements before, but this was different. His heir had imposed consequences upon his wife and forced the entire household to choose which authority mattered most. When William entered the king's private room, Charles did not ask what happened. He asked one devastating question: "Are you prepared to defend this to me?" William did not answer immediately. He knew the dispute touched areas where his authority overlapped with household arrangements, restricted family functions, and preparations for his future reign. Those preparations were the private systems used to organize responsibilities before an heir eventually becomes sovereign, and they gave the prince direct influence over certain internal decisions. But Charles still held sovereign authority, meaning the final power of the reigning monarch remained his. William could restrict access tied to his own responsibilities, but he could not simply erase Camilla's position beside the king. Charles opened the most damaging record himself. He read the passage once, then again. The monarch's expression tightened, and instead of defending his wife, he removed his glasses and placed them beside the folder. That small movement told William that the argument had changed. His father was no longer asking whether the files mattered. He was deciding what they required him to do. William chose his words carefully. He told Charles he would rather discover that he had judged the situation too harshly than learn later that he stayed silent because the truth was painful. The future king admitted that the decision had hurt him too. Camilla was not some distant court figure. She was his father's wife, and any action against her would cut directly into the family. Charles pushed back. He accused his son of turning a family failure into an institutional threat. William answered without raising his voice. "Inside a monarchy," he said, "family failures become institutional threats when private relationships begin affecting authority, access, and trust." The king looked down at the file again. Then came the admission William had been waiting for. Charles acknowledged that the authorization pursued after the Windsor confrontation should never have proceeded in that form. He would not overturn the restrictions, but the monarch imposed one condition: William would personally oversee what came next. No hiding behind courtiers. No passing the emotional cost to staff. If the decision damaged the family, the prince would have to witness that damage himself. William accepted, and within hours, Camilla began to understand exactly what that meant. Charles had not publicly chosen his son over his wife, but inside the palace, Camilla immediately understood what his refusal meant, and then the doors began closing. Power rarely disappears with a dramatic announcement. Sometimes it vanishes through smaller humiliations. A meeting removed from a diary, an aide quietly reassigned, a door that once opened, automatically remaining locked. For Camilla, that was how the new reality arrived. The title remained, the marriage remained, but the invisible network of privilege surrounding her had suddenly contracted, and each small change carried the same unmistakable message. William's decision was no longer theoretical. Camilla discovered the consequences, one instruction at a time. Selected restricted access permissions were withdrawn, private household consultation rights were reduced, and several matters that once reached her directly were redirected elsewhere. Restricted access meant formal permission to enter or participate in sensitive royal spaces, and discussions, normally limited to approved members of the household. She was still Charles's wife, and still queen, yet that made the humiliation sharper. Public dignity remained untouched, while private influence was being quietly dismantled. Camilla approached a meeting room she had entered many times before and expected the usual routine. Instead, an official stepped forward and explained that her authorization had changed. The queen did not argue. She did not demand a name or challenge the instruction. She simply stopped, absorbed the meaning of those words, turned around, and walked away. The moment lasted seconds, but it told her more than any formal letter could have done. Camilla returned to her rooms and dismissed her staff for several minutes. Alone, she finally allowed the shock to settle. Until then, part of her had believed the order might be softened, delayed, or quietly reversed by Charles. Now she understood that William's decision was being enforced exactly as issued. Charles came to her later, already knowing what had happened. Camilla asked why he had allowed his son's order to stand. The king answered that he could not ignore what he had read in the files. She stared at him, furious that both men now seemed united by evidence she believed had been stripped of context. Her anger shifted between husband and heir, because each represented a different loss. One had removed her influence, while the other had refused to restore it. Courtiers began adjusting quickly. Decisions once routed through Camilla moved toward William's office or Charles's principal household officials, senior staff responsible for managing the monarch's private and official work. Influence, she realized, depended not only on title, but on recognized access. Camilla stopped demanding immediate restoration. Instead, she asked Charles for one private meeting, without aides, files, or officials. He agreed. After days of orders, accusations, and sealed records, the decisive shift would come without a single official present. Just two people forced to decide what remained when power was taken away. For once, there were no advisors waiting outside with arguments prepared. No files lay open between them. No heir demanded answers. Charles and Camilla were simply husband and wife, facing the damage left behind when private loyalty collided with royal responsibility. She could have asked him one final time to overturn William's decision. Instead, she asked something far more personal: whether he still trusted her. And the king's answer changed the direction of the entire crisis. Camilla entered expecting resistance, but she no longer wanted another argument about rank or authority. The queen understood that forcing Charles to overturn William now would reopen the entire dispute and place father against son in a direct struggle over the monarchy. Royal hierarchy, meaning the order of authority and responsibility within the family, suddenly mattered less to her than the marriage itself. She wanted to know what remained between them after the power had been stripped away. Camilla looked at Charles and asked the question she had avoided for days. "Do you still trust me?" The king paused. He told her that he trusted the woman he had married, but he could not pretend every decision exposed in the files was defensible. His answer carried no anger, and that almost made it harder to hear. Charles was not rejecting her. He was separating love from judgment. Camilla finally admitted what she had refused to say before. Protecting her place within the royal structure had gradually begun to feel like protecting Charles himself. She had convinced herself that preserving access, influence, and control around his household helped shield the monarch from pressure. Somewhere along the way, she confessed, loyalty had become an excuse for choices she should have questioned. Charles reached for her hand. He did not promise restoration. The king told her that William had drawn a boundary he believed necessary, and reversing it now would damage the trust between father and heir. Camilla understood the message completely. Her husband still loved her, but he would no longer defend every decision simply because she had made it. Camilla made her choice. She would not challenge the restrictions again. She would continue the public duties, still appropriate to her position, but the disputed private privileges would remain surrendered. The Queen would not force Charles into a deeper rupture with William, and she would not demand that the prince retreat simply to spare her pride. Camilla stood before leaving and told Charles to inform William that there would be no appeal. The king remained silent after she was gone, relieved that the confrontation had ended and devastated by what ending it had cost. What ended quietly behind one closed door erupted across Britain the following morning, turning a private royal reckoning into a public judgment on the future of the crown. By sunrise, the secret was no longer contained. Television studios abandoned their planned schedules. Commentators scrambled to explain what privileges had actually disappeared. Outside royal gates, cameras multiplied as crowds gathered beneath headlines declaring an extraordinary transfer of influence inside Britain's most famous family. Yet beneath the noise was a simpler question. Had William humiliated his father's wife, or demonstrated exactly the kind of uncompromising leadership expected from a future king? William became the center of the national argument almost immediately. The prince had done something the public rarely saw so clearly. He had imposed boundaries on someone at the very heart of his own family. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's main official London residence and a central symbol of royal authority, issued carefully controlled language explaining that Camilla remained queen and retained her public position. What had changed were discretionary privileges, internal permissions, and access granted by royal authority, rather than rights permanently attached to her title. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace as broadcasters repeated the same fictional front page across morning coverage. William draws the line. The headline appeared beside images of William, Camilla, and Charles, turning a private family crisis into a national judgment. One morning presenter described the decision as the clearest sign yet that the future reign has begun shaping the present one. That phrase spread quickly because it captured what many people suddenly believed they were witnessing. William watched part of the coverage in silence. He saw commentators praising his resolve, others accusing him of humiliating Camilla, and still others questioning whether the future king had allowed personal history to influence institutional judgment. Catherine noticed his unease before he switched the television off. She reminded him that public approval had never been the purpose of the decision. The princess understood that if he began measuring duty by applause, the entire reason for drawing the boundary would disappear. Camilla became the other human face of the storm. Sympathy grew around the queen because the consequences now looked painfully personal, even to those who believed William had acted correctly. Some saw accountability, others saw humiliation. Charles remained caught between both readings, because every public defense of his wife risked weakening his son, while every silence made her isolation appear deeper. Then the palace removed the final uncertainty. A short communication confirmed that the revised arrangements would remain in effect. Charles was not preparing a quiet reversal once the headlines faded. Britain had delivered competing judgments, but the family still faced one final verdict. The crowds could debate winners and losers, but inside the family, there was one final reckoning left, and it would define what William's decision truly meant. In the end, there was no triumphant winner. William had protected the boundary he believed the crown could no longer afford to blur, but doing so wounded his father. Charles preserved his marriage, but only by accepting that love could not erase accountability. And Camilla kept her place beside the king, while surrendering the privileges that had become symbols of a much deeper conflict. The files had begun the crisis. What followed transformed it into something larger, a test of what loyalty actually means. William met Charles one final time, without advisors or household officials between them. The prince made clear that he had never intended to challenge his father's kingship or damage his marriage. His purpose had been to establish limits around influence, private access, and decisions touching the future crown. The crown, meaning the monarchy as an institution, rather than simply the person wearing the crown, had survived because difficult boundaries were finally being treated as responsibilities rather than personal attacks. Charles listened without interrupting. The king understood that reversing everything now would destroy the principle both men had painfully established. He told William that protecting the monarchy sometimes meant accepting decisions that hurt the family carrying it. "I know," the future king answered quietly. Neither man celebrated. Victory had no place in a conversation where father and son had both lost something. Camilla accepted the permanent loss of the disputed privileges. She stopped pursuing restoration and chose instead to protect what remained: her marriage, her public duties, and her relationship with Charles. The queen understood that continuing the fight would force her husband into another confrontation with his heir. She could remain beside the monarch without controlling every private channel surrounding him. Charles stayed beside Camilla personally, while accepting William's institutional judgment. That distinction became the emotional heart of the entire crisis. The king did not abandon his wife, but neither did he erase the consequences simply to protect her from pain. Affection remained. Accountability remained too. Neither felt gentle, but both could exist at once. William emerged changed as well. The prince had learned that authority was not proven by giving orders or winning confrontations. Real authority meant taking responsibility for the relationships damaged by those decisions. The files mattered because they exposed more than individual choices. They forced the royal household to define boundaries that loyalty and silence had allowed to remain dangerously unclear. William stripped away Camilla's remaining privileges, but the deeper consequence was something no royal decree could fully capture. Charles learned that love could survive without unquestioned protection. Camilla learned that belonging to the crown did not mean possessing every power surrounding it. And William learned the hardest lesson awaiting any future king. Sometimes preserving the monarchy means drawing a line through your own family, and then living with the pain on both sides of it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.